office, and Ralph happened to be walking by.
Okay.
And he came in, you gave him what I'll call the elevator pitch,
Yeah.
and he turned to me and said, "Have you ever read
Yes.
Stargazer?"
Yes.
I said, "No, I've heard about it. It's really hard to find because it's out of print." And he said, "This, and he clearly, I think the quote was, we've been waiting to hear this story. That almost all the scientists know about Galileo and sort of this rogue streak. That's very interesting."
Yeah.
So that was just to give you
No,
the
that's
context,
completely
that was
right. That's completely right.
Okay, so you want to just tell me about that in your own way?
So when Craig first came to the Sloan Foundation, we discussed the Galileo project. He described his take on the story was one that I was familiar with through the president of the Sloan Foundation, and a book called Stargazer, which he was very big on, but Craig didn't know about, but had actually come to these ideas on his own, through his own reading. And when I introduced him to the president of the foundation, who happened to be passing by, Ralph Gomery, Ralph mentioned this book, Stargazer, which Craig hadn't read at the time, but Ralph recognized that what Craig was talking about was very akin to the ideas in this book. He recommended that book to him, and he was surprised that someone who hadn't read that book had actually come to the same conclusion independently. And I think Craig then went and bought the book and found a lot of resonance with the ideas that he had. And so that was another reason that was an attractive thing for us, that we had somebody coming to these ideas, which we believe to be closer to the truth and the popular notion, on his own, and wanting to dramatize them in a kind of appealing and popular art form.
Why would you, as a science person and involved with the Science Foundation, want to cast more, not negative, but questionable light on Galileo's either methods or findings? I mean, why is that an attractive presentation?
I don't think we're interested in casting. I think Galileo is a great enough figure that his position is unassailable, and I don't think anyone, including Craig, is actually challenging his primacy. But one of our messages, scientists are human beings, and they have flaws and shortcomings like everybody else, and they're driven by the same kind of passions, which sometimes include ambition and jealousy as well as altruistic impulses. And I think the more we understand Galileo as a human being, the more interesting he becomes to us, the less of an icon he becomes. We gave David Sobel a grant for Galileo's daughter for similar reason. David first told me about these letters Galileo had kept that no one had translated into English, and I said, do it, and we'll support you, because it would be so fantastic. Not because the letters per se, they're very interesting, but because they were yet another angle onto this amazing figure of Galileo by looking at his relationship with his daughter. And that didn't necessarily all speak to his benefit either, but it showed us him as a father, as a human being, grappling with those issues of the time. So we're not interested in propaganda and saying all scientists are great and never make mistakes. So we welcomed, and Craig was basing on a lot of research. It wasn't like he was making stuff up out of whole cloth. He'd come to this on his own by doing a lot of work, and so it seemed very much in keeping with our mission.
Truth, as opposed to faith or reason, right? How did you feel about the Vatican? What happened when you went to the Vatican with Craig? What was that about? What was the purpose?
Yeah.
And so forth.
You may want to cut the next line, but it was two Jews going to the Vatican. It was a very funny scene, arriving and having very high-level meetings with the Cardinal, Minister of Culture, Cardinal Poupard, his name was. And, well, the Vatican is a fascinating place. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating place. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of history and culture, and the people that we met there were very cultivated, very educated, very intelligent. So there's a lot of basis for conversation. Of course, they also are members of the Vatican, and they have their own take on things. And the question was, could we find a way to take what we were doing and get them to at least agree to open a dialogue? And based on the meetings Craig and I had, they seemed surprisingly eager, at the time anyway, to engage with us. The fact that they even met with us at that level was itself very significant. And I think Cardinal Poupard actually sent Craig a formal statement of his intention to go ahead and welcome this kind of dialogue, and how he supported this project. So, I mean, that's very unusual.
I think Craig Owen and I went to the Vatican, so it was 3 Jews going to the Vatican also.
3 more.
Yeah. But Cardinal Poupard did say something about that, I think, I don't know the exact quote, but that there was mutual prejudice that exists between science and religion. How do you feel about that?
I think that's probably true. I think that there is prejudice on both sides. I personally don't believe that science and religion are not compatible. In other words, there are many scientists who are religious, and you can believe in both science and religion. I don't think that they're antagonistic.
How can you believe in both science and religion? I mean, look at the Bible. Moses didn't part the waters. That must have been some scientific thing, if in fact it happened at all.
There are many scientific explanations for biblical stories, but I mean, I think that it's also true that science can't answer every question, and science can't tell you the why of everything. And so I think there's room to believe in everything that's verifiable and scientifically proven, and then to say there's a whole series of gaps in places where faith of any kind can fill that in. That's my personal view. I know many scientists, though, who share that view, and of course there are scientists who are much more antagonistic towards religion for different reasons. So, and of course, on the side of religion, I don't need to, I think, enumerate religion's assaults on science, which are legion.
Rabbi Kula said crossing borders may be the key to wisdom. Do you agree with that?
To the extent that, a lot of what I do is bringing the two cultures together. The two cultures as defined by C.P. Snow, which is the culture of science, and the humanities, or everything that isn't science. And that's certainly about crossing boundaries. And I think anytime you get people to step outside of themselves and examine some of their own belief systems, whether they be scientific beliefs or religious beliefs, I think that's a good thing. And I think science, Kuhn's theory of scientific revolution argued that scientists are actually not as scientific as they think, that in fact they come up with a theory and they hold to it very tenaciously and very emotionally in the face of all kinds of data to the contrary, until the data is so overwhelming that the theory breaks apart and then the paradigm has to shift, so you can no longer sustain the old view. And that's one of the most influential books about how scientists work. So scientists are human beings. And I think it's fair to look at science that way, but it's also fair to say that not everything is relative and not everything is negotiable, and there are certain absolutes that science has shown us. So I think it's now pretty conclusive that the sun does not revolve around the Earth, nor do all the other planets.
And evolution? I mean, please.
Darwin continues to be a subject. Next year is the 150th anniversary of the publication of The Origin of Species, and that fight is still being fought. And we're supporting a National Geographic Nova show dramatization about Darwin. I'm talking to the BBC about another show about him, because again, as with Galileo, I think the more people understand who he was and the struggles he went through to arrive, and that his wife was a devout Christian, for example, Darwin's wife now, and that he in fact was not as antagonist towards religion until, I think, the end of his life, and his views were much more ambivalent.
We talked about a little bit, you started to talk about the relevancy of Galileo, the church, science, religion, Darwinism, and today, with the increasing fundamental sects in every religion, whether it's what I refer to as the crazy Jews, or the fundamentalist Christians or Islamic extremists. I mean, and the White House for the past 8 years, and the lack of funds for science, the lack of funds for stem cell research. I mean, this must be a much harder battle, no? I mean, it's incredibly relevant today.
Yeah, although I don't think the sky is falling. I think, first of all, funding for science by historic standards is still high. It's higher than it's been. I mean, there have been certain select areas that the administration might not have funded, but the NSF, NIH budgets have been going up. They haven't now going up at the same rate. And I think American science is still very strong. I think we have to stay competitive. It's also true that China and India and South Korea are competing more with us in these areas, and we're not going to have the field all to ourselves. But I think what you're referring to in terms of belief systems, I think there's been some backward movement towards a certain religious fundamentalism, and I think it's important to keep waging that battle, certainly about the teaching of creationism, or what is now called creation science, I think it's legitimate to teach that in religion, but not in the science classroom. And one of our candidates for president right now believes that it should be taught in the science classroom, which most people don't know about him. And that to me is not an acceptable, John McCain, yeah.
Whatever happened to the separation of church and state?
I think by and large that still exists in this country. I think it's one of the big arguments the Islamic fundamentalists have with us, because they don't believe in the separation of church and state, and they think that they'd like to annihilate that difference. But I'm not a pessimist. I don't think that as I said, the end of the world is coming. I think we need to renew our commitment to science. It's important, but I don't think that the average. I'm less concerned about the creationist view of the world, because I don't think you can ever reason with people who don't arrive at a view out of reason. They have their own motives. But I think I'm more concerned about the general public. They need to have a better understanding of why evolution matters. What does it really mean? What was Galileo's contribution? Why do we call him the father of modern science? And I think that going back to the rock opera about Galileo, that's one of the benefits of having a popular art form like that it will stimulate people's curiosity and interest about him. So when a movie like A Beautiful Mind comes out and it wins the Oscar for Best Picture about John Nash, the movie is good, but it has its limits. But then 1 million people go out and buy Sylvia Nasser's book, A Beautiful Mind, and read a much more in-depth analysis and story of John Nash, and they read other things about mathematicians, and so it stimulates people in a broader way. And I think that's what Galileo rock opera could do, in addition to drawing people to see the show itself.
Okay, I'm going to ask you 3 questions that are going to make you repeat what you just said to me, only in shorter segments, if you don't mind. So, first of all, why is Galileo called the father of modern science?
Galileo is called the father of modern science, or more strictly observational astronomy, because he used direct observation and experimentation. He took a telescope, which had been actually invented in Holland, improved it tremendously, turned it on the heavens, immediately discovered 4 moons around Jupiter. No one had ever seen them. They were named after him. And that whole notion of actually look outside yourself, see what's there, and then conduct experiments to find the laws that describe why things happen, that's the scientific method. And Galileo's the first one to have put it down in a systematic fashion and to have shown the way to Newton and to everyone else that followed.
What do you think would be the positive effect of having a musical or a theatrical presentation of Galileo, or presenting him in a sort of popular culture context?
Well, for one, a musical is fun. And most people think about science as homework, and it's hard and it's daunting. So right away, I'm going to see a musical. They're going to break out into song and dance, and they're going to talk about science. So I think you go with a different mindset, and I think that's great, because I think we all have inhibitions and hang-ups about how we approach science. And so right away, it I think changes the attitude people have towards the material. I don't think you can, the purpose of a rock music like that is not to actually teach you science, and I don't think you should even try to do that. It's an entertainment, but it stimulates you to think about who this person was. And if you have a compelling actor who you care about, then you're going to be intrigued by that character, and you might think about him, and you might want to go read a little bit more about him and understand what he was about. So it opens you up.
Can you think of an example where there was a popular form of entertainment that people became aware of a scientist through something? You mentioned Beautiful Mind.
The film A Beautiful Mind would be one example, certainly, that not too many people outside of the mathematical world and in economics had heard of John Nash until that film. And when the film came out, 1 million people went and bought a biography about Nash, but with the same title, called A Beautiful Mind, and read many other things about him. And I think Russell Crowe's performance made him real to people in a way that he hadn't been. I think Jodie Foster's performance in Contact showed why a woman or why anyone goes into astronomy, goes into this field, because it had to do with her relationship with her father. And by giving such a powerful performance, I think she was able to show again, it wasn't based on a historic figure, but why anyone would go into science. I think that was a good example. I think Apollo 13 was a good film about how the